Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew Johnson about alleged free energy devices. Now then, I interviewed a guy called Professor John Searle a couple of years back, whose device is called the SEG, the Searle Effect Generator. Now, I know that you're quite sceptical of that one, aren't you, Andrew?
Well, to some extent, I mean, as again, we've spoken about this before several times, and my view on the Searle devices, I think the underlying process that he's discovered is there's some validity to it.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that he describes it, I mean, again, it's a bit like Meyer. You know, he will describe it in unconventional terms, in sort of a language which is not really that scientific.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, you can't. You know, he does seem to have something there behind it. There is some phenomenon and some energy which seems to be being produced in an anomalous way. I know you know more about that than I do because.
Well, viewers can watch an interview that I did with John Searle and Fernando Morris, the engineer who's been working with him. Now, they haven't been able to prove the over unity. Well, sorry, I should take that back. It's not an over unity device. What the device does is, let's say this is the generator. You've got electricity coming off it. It gets its energy from the ambient air wherever it is. So if it's in this room, the air around it will start to cool down and the device itself cools down, and it's that energy that it's extracting that produces the electrical energy. So you can just run it outside and basically it's impossible to cool down the entire world, so therefore it's converting ambient heat into electricity. So it's not over unity at all, but if you could make something that does that, you've solved the energy crisis. You're just taking ambient heat out of the air and turning it into electricity. But they haven't demonstrated it in the scientific conditions. They haven't shown that it produces energy from the ambient heat.
And I mean,
but I did go through after the interview. I did sit with Fernando Morris. We had a meal, and he showed me some of the rollers, and they did say that there's basically sine waves encoded magnetically on those rollers, which is how they float round the central core. And that was true. I tested that with my key ring. There is indeed a sine wave encoded on those circular magnets. So I think the principle of the rollers flying round, floating basically, because there's two magnetic components which keep the roller floating. One of them, you've got the force pushing it out, and then you've got a magnetic force pulling it in. So it's kept floating in midair by two opposing forces in equilibrium. So a lot of the principles have been demonstrated on the Searle effect generator, but I don't think they've had the magic, yes, it's producing energy.
Right.
So, and I've not heard from Fernando Morris since I've interviewed them. So the jury's out for me on it.
Right, and I mean, you know, I'd come across, you know, a friend of ours that had seen some of John Searle's earlier demonstrations or his claims about having developed his own flying saucer, and this was, I think, in the 60s that he came out with these claims. And then, you know, this much heralded press conference that he held where he said he was going to reveal this technology to the world, he took this cover off and it was a cardboard model underneath it.
Yeah, I've heard all those stories as well.
So, you know, there are some question marks there about that. And also the recent program that was done by Bradley Lockerman, that has interviews with some of the people that worked with him before, and not all of them give him a glowing review.
Okay, well, we'll leave that one in the question mark box. Now, what about the next one, which is, you know a little bit about this, Andrew, the Bedini motor?
Yes, now this was, you know, again, we've talked about this quite a bit, and there seem to be a number of versions of the Bedini motor technology, and the basic idea is that with a conventional electric motor, you have opposing poles and a commutator, you know, and you spin the spindle using a commutator in between the opposing magnets to get the motor to turn. With a Bedini design, you have opposing poles, north facing north, south facing south, in a you know, a ring, and you get it's the repulsive force which sends the motor around. You know, it's a different configuration of the magnetic field basically. And Bedini's central claim is that when you arrange the magnets and the coils like that, as the motor is going round, it's periodically, you know, in hundredths or thousandths of a second, stopping and starting all the time it goes round.
Right.
And every time you get to the stopping motion, you essentially get a collapsing field, and then out of that you get what he calls a radiant pulse. So as well as this conventional forward EMF, or which I think you, as we were describing earlier, which it would normally be filtered out for safety, you get this radiant pulse which comes out, and then you can if you arrange it such that this secondary coil picks up this radiant pulse and you feed that into a battery, you can essentially run the motor off one battery whilst charging a secondary battery. Yeah. That is essentially the way that it works. So you don't actually
run for months,
forever, until the battery.
So you've got one battery powering the motor, and the motor itself is charging another battery.
Correct.
And does it swap over at some point
in the original Bedini demonstration that I saw, he didn't specifically state that, but in a later YouTube reproduction, which I've got a clip of, which has now been taken down, I would mention, a chap had done a reproduction where he designed a circuit such that the circuit measured the relative voltage in these two batteries, and when the one that was driving the motor went below about 4 volts, I think it was from a 12-volt battery, it would switch the circuit. Okay. And so the one that had been charged up would then run the motor, and then it would switch it back again when that one had discharged. And he said he said he literally just left this thing in his shed or his basement. It ran for months. That's what he says on this video.
Right. And because it's possibly something to do with when you have a coil, an electric coil, and you put a DC voltage across that, you basically store energy within the field around the coil. Okay. If you short that coil out, the field will collapse and you get what's called a forward EMF. So you'll get a voltage across the coil which can then do work against a load. Now, I think the theory goes, and I don't know whether this is true or not, that there's something in a collapsing field, there's another component which is additional to what can be measured. I'm not describing it very well. Perhaps it's something to do with the 3 vectors I was talking about earlier, that there's perhaps another vector at 90 degrees to the 3 vectors. There's perhaps another vector in another dimension you were saying that is somehow being tapped into in a collapsing field from a coil. That there's physicists may be sitting going, what's he talking about? And we were saying before, is this linked into the Maxwell's equations and the missing part of Maxwell's equations?
Correct, that's right. And if you look at Maxwell's original equations, my understanding is that the original equations that Maxwell came up with had extra dimensional elements in them, outside the normal 3 dimensions, which he had realized were relevant to explain, the way that electromagnetic fields, went through a vacuum and this sort of thing. And it was apparently Gibbs and Heaviside, 2 mathematicians, who took Maxwell's original equations and said, oh yeah, we can understand what you're saying here, Maxwell, but actually for most of what we're doing in physics at the moment, we don't need all these extra dimensional terms. They're just introducing extra complexity which we don't actually need, because that's nothing to do with any observed phenomena that we normally observe. And so they threw all that away, and what went forward into the mainstream physics from that point was a reduced set of Maxwell's equations, which everyone obviously took to be the full set, and they weren't.
And Maxwell's equations describe electric fields and how that relates to charge. They also describe how the sum of a magnetic flux through a Gaussian surface is always 0. I know this might mean nothing to some viewers, but in Faraday's law, that a time-varying magnetic field induces an electric field, and there's also Ampere's circuit law. So they're basically the laws of electromagnetism and electricity. Right. That's what they describe.
Right. And I mean, my understanding is that Maxwell was able to calculate the speed of light from his own sets of equations, and that was later verified by experiment completely independently of what Maxwell had worked out theoretically.
So, okay, let's look at the potential conspiracy part of this. And they've come along and said, no, you're not having that bit of the equation. We're going to keep that. So, what's going on there, Andrew? Do you think that's they've been sent there to steal the equations?
Again, you ask the question: well, who would have sent them? How would they know that they needed to censor this information, or kind of twist it in some way, or put it to one side? Those sorts of questions, I don't have an answer for. But when you look at the timing of it, And for example, we talked earlier about Tesla and how a lot of his research was being done when the big energy interests were starting to become, corporate interests.
You're
when the oil
talking in
companies,
the
19,
early part of the 20th
yeah,
century.
1920s, 1930s, when they were starting to, get big oil companies going and big energy companies. Tesla was doing it at that sort of time, and Maxwell's work was really a forerunner to that. So if we take the view that there are certain people who have more knowledge than we do, they could probably see the way things were going to go in science, and so you can imagine they would need to make sure that Maxwell's equations were watered down to slow down the pace of discovery that would maybe lead people to a source of free energy in these extra dimensions, for example.
All right, Andrew. Well, let's just finish by discussing again. There are organisations that are set up or have been and made claims. One of them was called Stern or Stern.
That's right.
I remember this was a few years ago. I got a lot of emails about this. There was a lot of excitement about it, and they had this big demonstration where they were going to show that they had this free energy device, and it all just went pear-shaped as far as I can remember.
Correct. What they did was, you're absolutely right, because I followed that as well. That came about probably 2007, 2008, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago perhaps. And they set up a demonstration with this device in a glass case, supposedly producing free energy. But then when they set this thing up, they put all these spotlights on it. The heat from the spotlights meant that the device didn't work, and they had to stop the demonstration. I think it only ran for a couple of hours, and that was that. So yeah, we're laughing, and it did become a bit of a laughing stock. And after that, they kind of went underground, and they didn't really disclose a lot of details about their technology. Right. But then I think it was approximately 18 months or a year ago, I haven't got the information to hand, I'm just working from memory, they came back on the scene with a new video about their technology, which they said they were moving around magnets. That's where they got this idea, where they were getting excess energy from moving around magnets. But when they came out with this new video, around about a year or so ago, it looked to me very much like a Bedini motor, because they again had opposing magnets with a sort of double circuit where the one side of the circuit was driving the motor and the other was extracting this pulse from another pair of coils. So it looked very, very similar to a Bedini motor that I'd already seen from his research. And just to add in a little bit about the Bedini motor, you'll find a lot of information on a site called energyfromthevacuum.com. But the thing about that site is it is owned by Tony Craddock. Now, Tony Craddock is, guess what, an oil industry consultant. And you can go and look at his website, www.craddock.biz, and you'll see all the major oil companies listed as clients. He backs the Energy from the Vacuum video series. He backs the series of videos that have been produced about the Bedini motors, and it was his website, or his company, Energetic Productions LLC, which filed copyright violations against my YouTube channel, which resulted in its closure because of those things.
It's a tangled web. If somebody does produce something which appears to solve the energy crisis, really, there's only one way to go, is to not patent it, is to not go for investment. Really, I would suggest that you put out all the information on the internet and try and spread it as much as you can before people would then say, well, you're not going to profit from the idea. But I would say that if you're going to change the entire human race and everything on this planet, then thinking about your own pocket is really a little bit short-sighted.
Absolutely, and there's a number of people that have done exactly that. I mean, John Hutchison doesn't patent anything, for example. And it appears also that we have this, and I don't know the full details, there is a village in Switzerland, I believe, where they say they have a free energy generator, sort of tucked away, and it's powering their village, and they keep this thing sort of well under wraps.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But apparently, if you connect to the right people, you can go and see them, and they will show you this thing working.
What country is this in? Did you say?
It's in Switzerland, I believe. Or maybe it's in Sweden. I always get Sweden and Switzerland mixed up for some strange reason in my overloaded brain, but. They apparently do have a small community which is powered by a free energy device.
This was one of John Searle's claims, that he had it built into his wall, his Searle effect generator, and he never had electricity bill. And the electricity board kept coming around saying he's using electricity, but he's got no bill. In fact, I think he even said it was putting energy back into the grid.
Yeah. Well, I heard the claim that he was actually, he'd attached a wire to a nearby pylon or something and he was extracting energy from that.
Right,
So
okay.
I don't know what the truth of that is, but that's what I'd heard.
All right then, Andrew. Well, fascinating insights, and thank you very much indeed, and good luck with the event on the 29th of September.
30th.
30th of September. Okay, it just remains for me to say, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.